flank of the Catalina Mountains. And they will share with us the battle that they have engaged in there with 3 evil grasses: Fountaingrass, Natalgrass, and the ever persistent Bermuda grass. And so our first speaker will be Patty Estes, and she is head of Catalina State Park Buffalo Slayers, which is a volunteer group. And she directs efforts in the removal of bufflegrass, fountaingrass, and Sahara mustard, which is another evil plant. Then John Scheuring will share with us, and he is the conservation chairman for the Arizona Native Plant Society, the state organization. And also with our Tucson chapter, he's a member of the executive committee. He coordinates and plans field trips and has also led many restoration and invasive species activities. And then finally, oops, just a minute. So Chuck Lefebvre was going to also speak, but unfortunately he's not able to be with us tonight. But Chuck has certainly had a presence in the projects that we're going to be hearing about, and has participated in many programs that involve restoration and the removal of invasive species. And he also is the owner of the Desert Seed Source, a company that provides seeds for Arizona nurseries. So I'm going to turn this back over to Lynn, who will then get us going. Thank you.
Okay, so Patty, you need to unmute and share your screen, and then we should be good to go. And we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Oh.
I'm sorry, and I excuse me, but I forgot to say that if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And at the end of the program, we'll have time for questions and discussion. Thank you, Patty. Sorry.
Okay, we'll get into speaker mode. There we go. Okay, good evening. Many of you might remember that this talk was originally scheduled for last spring, but then of course COVID struck, and so eradication efforts really started about 5 years ago. And it came about as a partnership, of course, between the Native Plant Society, Arizona Native Plant Society, the Buffalo Slayers, which I founded also in 2015, and Catalina State Park, which was, with us, backing us from day one, and also as well as the Coronado National Forest, the Catalina District. And here is the villain. You probably recognize it instantly, but it's a very beautiful grass. That's part of the problem. It's a very beautiful grass when it's by itself, but it's terrifying when you see its ability to rapidly take over riparian areas. When you can no longer find healthy stands of native grasses in the canyon, you have a real problem on your hand. And the disappearance of deer grass, in addition to fountain grass, was a real trigger, I think, for this project. So let me tell you a little bit more about fountain grass. It is native to South Africa and closely related to bufflegrass. It was introduced to Arizona on purpose by the USDA Soil Conservation Service about 80 years ago now. It was planted throughout the Catalina foothills in the resorts and in people's yards. And it aggressively then spread to the riparian canyons in the Catalinas and the rincons, especially in the last 20 years. Now it crowds out other riparian plants, as I mentioned. It shades pools and it competes with natives for water. So here's a map of our project area, largely Catalina State Park, which for anyone joining us from outside of Tucson, it's northwest of the Tucson metro area. And I'm showing the boundary of the state park with the green line. And largely east of that is the Coronado National Forest. And I'm showing the Bighorn Fire burn area shaded in brown. And then the three canyons that we worked in, Cargodera is in the north, and I'm showing our project area as a red line. That's about 2 miles that we've worked so far. And then south of that, sort of at the bottom of the slide in teal, is Alamo. And we've worked about 1.25 miles of that canyon. Then both of these canyons flow into the Sutherland Wash, which I'm showing in yellow. And we've also worked a little over 2 miles of that canyon. And just to let you know, we still have a lot of work to go to do. So we're each year trying to get a little bit farther up into those canyons, and we still have a lot of fountaingrass and other invasives going up those canyons. Just saying in case anyone's interested in getting involved. Okay, so let me show you some photos of Cargodera Canyon. It's a beautiful canyon. It's a rugged canyon on the, you know, I don't know, does my, oh yeah, I do have, can you see my cursor? No. Oh yes. Okay. That way I don't have to say left and right.
Yes,
so
your cursor. Use it.
well, anyway, on the left, you see Cargodera, about where the Sutherland Trail crosses the canyon. And most of the time there's a nice pool there. Just below that is a pretty big waterfall most of the time. It's of course dry now, and then you get into a kind of a steep, rugged part of the canyon. I'm showing that on the right. And Fountaingrass not only is, you know, by the pools and by the water, but it can cover the canyon bottom and also go up the steep sides of the canyon. So the project involved hitting invasives only with a targeted post-emergent spray of herbicide, and we used Aquamaster, which is a mixture of the herbicide glyphosate and a surfactant that is safe for amphibians. Okay, getting to the upper part of the canyon was a challenge, but fun, and helping us get personnel and herbicide, gallons and gallons of herbicide, up to about the area of the trail crossing. We were greatly aided by the Forest Service and their ATVs. So once we got up to the trail crossing, that's where the real fun began, and we donned our backpack sprayers and we got to work. So early on, the amount of fountain grass was almost overwhelming. You would see sections of the canyon that looked like this. And it really overwhelmed our ability to even bring up enough herbicide and people to feel like we were making a difference. But in addition to recruiting extra bodies, we found it was easier to break the canyon up into sections. And the lower section we could hike into with backpack sprayers and spray up to about the waterfall. And then we could use the help of the Forest Service for transport into the upper part of the canyon. So, you know, we'll use that again to move up into the canyon further. But looking at this picture, you can see how it might be daunting, but after years and spraying several times a year, we now are seeing parts of the canyon that look more like this. So we have a lot of dead plants. I think you can see them, but I'll, you know, sort of point them out. But you still have to remain vigilant because lurking on the sides are these young fountain grass plants that, you know, have escaped our earlier sprays or come back since we last sprayed. So Alamo Canyon, much like Cargodera, beautiful canyon, rugged. It has a waterfall too, and lots of boulders. But you can see that it was very infested with fountain grass as well, but also much success. We've kind of cleared the lower parts of the canyon and we're moving up canyon where, again, the canyon gets kind of narrow and steep, and we have a lot of fountain grass yet to tackle. So you might think with our success that it's been pretty easy, but as John Scheuring would say, no way. So he said, make sure you mention the boulders, the steep slopes, the heaviness of the backpack sprayers, and the hot weather during periods of green up post-monsoon. But I don't want to really discourage you. But another thing that we found that kind of set us back just a little bit is that opening up the canyon by removing the fountain grass allowed for some secondary invasives. So, and you know, even with that, we had to keep our eye on fountain grass trying to work its way back. But anyway, the secondary invasives, some of them Susie mentioned, Natalgrass, Bermuda grass, soft feather pappus grass, red brome, and Sahara mustard. Okay, we have some pictures of those. You're probably familiar with quite a few of them. Natalgrass, also a very pretty grass, but it can spread like crazy. And I think John will have a picture in his talk related to that. Bermuda grass, we're probably all used to seeing some amount of Bermuda grass in all of the riparian canyons in the Catalinas. And with the ongoing drought, one thing we've noticed is that it actually survives drought pretty well. And if you've ever tried to get rid of it out of your yard, you know it's really, really hard. The pappus grass, it's pretty much a fixture in Catalina State Park now, and outside riparian areas too. And my nemesis, Sahara mustard. It seems like it's really exploded in the last several years. We have had some pretty good rains, and it breaks my heart because it really competes with wildflowers. And Alamo Canyon especially is just so heavily infested. And the picture I have on the right, I've called Sahara mustard versus Phacelia, who will win? And I think we know the answer unless we actually act to like shift the balance. And we have been spraying, we have been on our hands and knees weeding, we've been pulling it up, and we actually have made really good progress. So the lower part of the canyon, again, we have really cleared Sahara mustard out. But when we get up near, if you know, at the junction with Dead Horse Canyon, it's still a real problem. But here's a last slide on the left, red brome. It really has filled the Alamo Canyon extensively the last couple of years. And then sort of a success story, the right picture is Sahara mustard under a mesquite. And this was what you found during all throughout the lower canyon for several years. And now that's pretty much under control and all gone. But again, let's get back to fountaingrass. It's kind of like whack-a-mole. Whenever you think you got it, here it comes back again. But again, to really show you our success, we went from areas that had like vigorous, healthy growth of fountaingrass to, sprays, and years later, much diminished patches. And of course, even when it looks dead, if you look very closely, it seems like there's always something still alive. So you have to really look because it's not dead yet. But then, with diligence, you can eliminate it. So our effort is paying off. And another sign of success, other than just the lack of fountain grass, is that the natives are coming back. Deer grass is more abundant than ever, and that is really good to see. In addition, wild cotton, it's no longer competing for water as much. You're seeing nice wild cotton plants, monkey flowers in Alamo Canyon. They are just everywhere. They're taking over, as you can see, where fountain grass has been removed, and lots and lots of monkey flower. So, and trees, ash and cottonwood trees are coming back. On the left picture, you'll see ash and willow near stands of dying fountain grass, and on the right, a young cottonwood. We always like to see young cottonwoods and other young trees coming back to these canyons. So in summary, I'd like to stress a few take-home points, and that is that we can restore our riparian habitats that have been clogged by invasives. And it takes persistence, it takes resprays. We visited these canyons several times a year, at least 3 times a year, during any time when there's green up. We're now spraying all invasives as they appear, as some of them move back in where fountain grass was. And realistically, we know this is a multi-year project, 5 to 8 years. Some places we've been removing fountain grass for at least 5 years. So, and then you just have to have long-term monitoring and stewardship. So you need, the commitment from, volunteers to go back in and make sure it's not getting out of hand. So with that, I am going to turn this talk over to John Scheuring, and he's going to talk about the Bighorn Fire and a little bit about our summer drought. So I am going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Patty. Let me see if I can get a full screen going here.
You're good.
Okay. Okay. We were humming right along to the end of May. Actually, we had a long, wet winter season this year, and we were still able to spray Fountaingrass and Alamo Canyon up towards almost the 25th of May. And then along came the Bighorn Fire, and it changed things. And it's also changed how we perceive our way forward. And I'd like to share that with you. The Bighorn Fire started more or less right across the street from where I live on the night of the 5th of June. And it was a lightning strike that struck right here, right at the base of a fault escarpment, which is just down the hill from Bighorn Peak. And that's why it's called the Bighorn Fire. And it struck there and it burned eastwards. They came in with slurry to keep it from burning westwards into the town of Oro Valley, and they did a good job. And so it burned eastward straight into the watershed of Catalina State Park. And it burned for 6 days at the elevation levels of about 2,500 feet to 4,000 feet. And in that area, the main fuel are grasses. Many of the woody plants are so far apart, they didn't burn from one plant to another, but they were carried by grasses. In the foreground, you do see, oh gosh, where it started here, and it moved westward through Dead Horse Canyon, and then westward through Alamo Canyon. And this long line of burning is Montrose Canyon that's on fire here. And then the fire burning going to the left, and then up around the corner is Romero Canyon. That was all on fire. This burned for 6 or 7 days before it breached to the south and spilled over to the south slope of the Catalinas. And then it breached Romero Pass to the west, to the east, and went on up in the direction of Mount Lemmon. We were able to get in fairly early in August because Catalina State Park opened its trails partially to hikers way before the Forest Service opened theirs. And so about, oh my gosh, about the 10th of August, we were able to get in and go up above the lip of Alamo Canyon and take a look, and above the lip of Cargodera Canyon as well. And our first impression was just total devastation. Every place we looked, I mean, it was the woodies, the succulents, the grasses. I mean, it was just, it had been nuked. And that was our first impression. And particularly the succulents, the barrel cactus, the prickly pears, the saguaros, the hedgehogs, they were just obliterated. And in the background here, you see Selagian rupincula, and it was totally charred. But as we hiked around more and more, we spent a lot of time up there, we started to make out little islands of unburned areas. Some of these islands were only a matter of a couple square yards, and others were several thousand square yards. And there were lots of unscathed ocotillos, saguaros, mesquites, and grasses. And from these areas, we had quite a lot of hope that the recovery after the fire is going to come from these islands spreading outwards. And this was only on the northwest side. The fire maybe have had a different effect elsewhere in the Catalinas, but this is what we saw. And it left us with quite a lot of hope for the recovery. Another thing that was very hopeful is that as we peered down into the canyons, here we're looking at Montrose Canyon and then lower Cargodera Canyon, we saw ribbons of green. Some areas were intermittently scorched, but for the most part, ribbons of green, up until about a third of the way up the slopes at the base. And so there was quite a lot of vegetation and habitat that was left intact. Whereas if you got higher up on the slopes and off onto the benches, things were pretty grim. Down in these canyons in late August, we could hear all sorts of bird species, because they had taken refuge in these green belts in the canyons. This was so good to see. And then another thing that was very encouraging in August and later in September were that many of the native woody plants, in spite of the very chronic drought that we had this summer, managed to sprout from the base. The limber bush pictured here, which looked early on totally scorched, they were greening up with young buds and leaflets at the base of the plants. And this was just from the stored sap at the base of the plant. The desert spoons, the dazzlerians, many of them, of course, became rolling fireballs because they would catch on fire and they would unroot themselves and roll down the hill on fire. And this, of course, really spread the fire, but not all of them did that. And many of them were still rooted. They looked charred at the base, but they were greening up in their leaves and in their fronds. And we've seen elsewhere after fires that these are tough plants, and they can take some pretty hot burns. And the one that really surprised us was the fairy duster, the Calliandra. In fact, it looked like this species was responding favorably to fire insofar as growth was stimulated much more than the growth would have been normally. And we saw quite a lot of young, vigorous plants coming up from underground living parts of fairy dusters throughout the burned areas. And we expect that next spring it's going to be kind of a dazzling year for fairy duster blooms. But in addition to these species, we saw the white-thorn acacias, the cat-claw acacias, and particularly the gray thorns, ziziphus, were coming back very vigorously from the base of the plants as well. So this was quite encouraging. However, as we walked the burned areas, the charred areas, we found acres and acres and acres of little charred grass stubs. And these grass stubs are layman love grass stubs. We had never really noticed how ubiquitous and penetrating layman love grass was in the landscape until they were burned and you saw the stubs and the extent of the stubs. And it became quite apparent as we walked up slopes and down slopes and across slopes that layman love grass was the fuel that carried the fire for the first 6 days on the north side of the Catalinas, the northwest side of the Catalinas. We know that the native grasses do not carry fire. The stems are just too fine, and the plants typically do not grow as close together as layman's and bufflegrass. And so this was quite a sobering sight to see. but in retrospect, not surprising. So let's talk about layman's love grass. This is a grass that is so common, hardly anybody knows what it looks like. And hardly anybody can really recognize it and distinguish it from other grasses. We're always looking for side oats grama or blue grammas, you know, the really distinguishing pretty grasses, but not layman's love grass. It just happens to be everywhere. This grows along our roadsides all over southern Arizona and in our HOAs and up and down our desert slopes. Layman's love grass, I think we have forgotten the history, came in and was introduced by the USDA Soil Conservation Service in the 1930s. At the same time, bufflegrass and many other African grasses were brought in the search for a miracle grass to stabilize the soil and to provide fodder for the cattle. And they screened hundreds of different species, and the two species that came out as the winners for the Soil Conservation Service and others were bufflegrass and layman love grass. And by the late 50s and early 60s, you could buy tons of either of seed of either layman's love grass or bufflegrass. And ADOT, Arizona Department of Transportation, seeded layman's love grass exclusively in the 70s, 80s, and stopped towards the end of the 80s along the right-of-ways of all of the interstates in Arizona and the state highways and many of the county roads across southern Arizona. And also the federal agencies, particularly the Forest Service, being a branch of the Department of Agriculture, was also very aggressive in seeding layman's love grass, particularly on cattle leasing areas. So that's the legacy of it. Fortunately, layman's love grass seed is no longer available for seed, and it's not being seeded. But we're living with populations that were introduced from the past, large populations. So what happened to the canyons where we have been driving out fountaingrass after the fire? And just as important as the fire was this historic drought, monsoon drought that we had this year. We had a few little showers in the month of July, and then after that, nothing. In the Catalinas, on the west side of the Catalinas, we've had probably less than 0.3 of an inch in the last 3 months. Well, we've been hiking up in these canyons where we've taken out the fountain grass, and we have been delighted by what we see. For one thing, we don't see washed out canyons with a lot of erosion because there wasn't any water. But we are seeing spectacular growth of native woody trees and perennial plants. And here we have a young oak tree sapling that is about 3.5 feet high, and it's growing in dead fountain grass mulch, and it's happy as can be. And it doesn't have to compete with any invasives or any other plants around for moisture. It's going deep with its roots down in the canyon bottom, and it's getting enough moisture to come up and grow. We're also seeing seep willows, Arizona walnuts, Arizona ash, cottonwoods, Gooding willows that are taking off and growing like gangbusters because they're growing in the absence of all of these invasive plants that they had to compete with before. So it's good news. And it's also good news that all of these woodies, and we have desert broom as well, are coming up during this season to bind down the soil in these canyons that are going to carry the future runoff from all these burned areas in the Catalinas. So this has been a good thing over the last couple of months. At the same time, in spite of all the drought, we do see two invasive species that we are quite concerned about. Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass is out there. It's surviving all of this drought, and it continues to send out runners and suckers, and it's just hunkering down and waiting for moisture. And once it gets moisture, in the absence of the fountaingrass, and so much open land to grow in, it's going to grow and grow fast. We're concerned about Bermuda grass because Bermuda grass will take over entire riparian canyons if nothing is done about them. Take a look at Aravaipa Canyon down here, just to the east of Tucson, to the east of Mammoth. It's one of the most beautiful riparian canyons in the entire state of Arizona, and is home to a diversity of plant and animal species that are right up there towards the top of our habitats in Arizona. However, anybody that's Aravaipa Canyon will know that from one end to the other, you're walking through a monoculture almost of Bermuda. It's really sad. It's taken over this beautiful habitat. And it's just because it was allowed to grow. So now that we see that it's incipient areas in the Catalinas, we need to get in there and we need to snuff it out before it goes any further and allow the natives to come back. And the second thing that we're seeing that is quite concerning is Natalgrass. Lots of it, especially on the upper ends of Cargodera and Alamo Canyon. And this little sucker it's a South African grass, yet another South African import. And it's highly resistant to drought. And it's very opportunistic and grows like crazy once there's a little bit of moisture. Natalgrass, you see the inflorescence, the flower here, and in good conditions, the inflorescence are very fluffy, soft, pretty pink, and once you get stands of it, it's very handsome. But the stuff explodes, and once it goes to seed, the next year it'll explode 10,000-fold. Down east of Tumacacori, 2 years ago, Natalgrass was present only in low numbers one year, and the next year it covered these slopes, and this is what it does. So we're quite keen on these canyons. As soon as we get some moisture and plants do start to green up again, to go up there and snuff out both the Bermuda grass and the Natalgrass, just so that we can get it in check before these plants are allowed to take off, especially during this critical time of recovery after the fire. So what are the take-home points that we've learned about the fire and the drought? First of all, the Bighorn Fire in the Catalina Northwest area was spotty, and recovery is happening, starting with native woody trees and bushes. The Bighorn Fire in the Catalina Northwest was carried by layman lovegrass. Riparian canyons were intermittently spared along the bottoms. Fountaingrass controlled canyons have excellent woody plant growth after the fire and under extreme drought. Abundant Bermuda grass and Natalgrass seedlings are present in some canyons and need to be controlled before they get out of hand. And lastly, and ending this on a very positive note, the drought-stricken monsoon this year following the Bighorn Fire has been a godsend. It would have been a disaster if we had had a lot of rain this summer and all this ash would have swept down from the upper reaches of the Catalinas and come through the canyons and buried them and caused all sorts of erosion across the Catalinas. So we've been spared immense amount of erosion this year in the Catalinas, thanks to the drought. I'd like to give a special thanks to our hardcore volunteers. These people, there's 14 of them, who really were the core volunteers, have worked over, some of them a few years, some of them 5 years. And these have been very rough conditions, slogging 32 to 35 pound backpacks over rocky terrains. And I'm happy to announce that we did not have one single accident, not one single broken bone, a lot of sore muscles, but nothing to be worried about. And I'd like to simply read through here: Carl Boswell, Charles Corson, Don Dunkel, Patty Estes, Bill Grimes, Mai Ho, Chuck Lefebvre, Rice Lindley, John Little, Alan Morgan, Ed Nigel, Stan Ross, and Stu Vexler. And we would also like to give special thanks to our land managers and funder. The Catalina District of the Forest Service has provided backpack sprayers and herbicides, and very critically, they have provided UTV transport and transport personnel when needed to get up to that rugged upper Cargodera Canyon. It was not an easy trip, because just because you're riding on an ATV, it doesn't mean that it's comfortable. We were going over rocks that were 2 feet in diameter, and it was back-breaking just to ride in these things. Catalina State Park provides the equipment storage for us, which is quite important, in an area where we can clean up our sprayers after our sprays. And the Friends of Catalina State Park have provided funding for incidental urgent purchases. And these have come in very, very, very handily to have those funds on hand when needed. And finally, special thanks to our photographers, Sue Carnahan, Don Dunkel, Patty Estes, John Little, and Chuck Lefebvre. Finally, we invite you to join us. We need people who like to backpack and like squirt guns, because if you like to backpack and you like squirt guns, you would love spraying bad guys like Fountaingrass and Natalgrass. But we also need people who can do scouting for us and scout in small groups to go up into the reaches of these canyons and let us know if it's appropriate time to spray or not. So if you'd like to join us, just send us an email at aznpsconservation@yahoo.com, or the address that Lynn gave, nativeplantstucson@gmail.com. Okay. There we go.
Great, thank you both for a very interesting presentation. Susie, you've been monitoring the chats, right? So would you like to moderate the questions here? And you need to unmute yourself before you try to start.
Okay, I was trying to unmute.
Okay, take it away.
Let's see here. So, and actually, something that John just said at the end about needing scouts, one of the questions that came up was about what visual cues do you use to know when to spray? So what would these scouts be looking for? And then There's a couple, then they want to know what months seem most effective and what brand of sprayers do you use? But the question about how do you know when to spray, I think that's a good place to start.
Well, for one thing, the plants are vigorous and green. And it just depends on the kind of year we have. If we have a good wet year, good wet winter year, or a good wet monsoon, we already know ahead of time that the plants are green enough to spray. But it's when we've had intermittent droughts or low rain, we don't know up in the canyons what the situation is. And we need to go up there and scout ahead of time to know if it's worth spraying. So it's not only that if the plants are green, if they're flowering, because if they're flowering, then that's critical that we get up there and spray before they go to seed. And also if the plants are vigorously growing or not.
So, okay. And then, so I guess when it says what months, it would depend on the rains and
Yeah, and typically
what they look like.
we spray bufflegrass twice a year. And in the monsoons, the bufflegrass is typically sprayed between the end of August to the middle of October. And then we'll switch over to Fountaingrass in the Catalinas mid-October to almost the end of November. And then we can start spraying bufflegrass again mid-February to the end of March. And typically we'll spray fountaingrass in the Catalinas from the end of March all the way to the end of May if there is sufficient moisture. We use Chapin sprayers.
Oh, okay, thank you. And then this question came up, Patty, this came up early in your presentation. Can you briefly describe how to distinguish fountain grass from deer grass?
I think, it's really helpful on any of these grasses if they're flowering or they have seed heads. So the deer grass has I don't know if I could get well, anyway, in the picture, it's kind of a very slender seed head and flower head, whereas the fountain grass has that like foxtail, kind of pinky foxtail seed head. If they don't have seed heads, then John can correct me if I'm wrong. I think the fountain grass has a little bit broader leaf blade than the deer grass.
Yes. Well, the fountain grass is much more erect and it has almost a yellowish hue to it. The deer grass is more floppy and it has kind of a buff green look to it. It takes some getting used to, but once you do, you get a pretty good search image.
And is there bufflegrass present in these areas?
In Cargodera, the bufflegrass would be up on the sort of the benches above the canyon. We had a really large patch and we haven't gone to see, or maybe John Little could answer this, whether that area actually burned north of Cargodera. But for the most part, there is a little bit, but not very much bufflegrass in the canyon bottoms.
Okay, and I don't know, John Little, did you want to say anything about that? Or maybe, I don't know if he's still there.
Yeah, he's there. He just needs to unmute.
I'm sorry, I got tired before we got that
Oh.
far.
Did you hear the question?
Oh yeah, I heard the question.
Oh.
I didn't get as far as that big bufflegrass patch.
Okay.
Even if it burned, I'm sure it's gonna bounce right back.
Wow.
But it's in a place that's really difficult to get spray to. So I'm not sure if we're ever gonna get at it. Maybe John has a plan.
Well, now that the cat claw acacia is burned, maybe we can get in there.
There you go. And then someone wants to know if there's any evidence of bufflegrass and fountaingrass hybridizing.
I don't know. Have you heard of that, John?
If there's any what?
If-
Say that again?
Oh, if bufflegrass and fountaingrass hybridize.
No, they do not.
Oh, good. That sounds like some new evil thing. And then, well, we had some. And I wondered this too about the burned stubs that were the Lehman's lovegrass. And can you tell if it's still alive? And how could you tell that it was, first of all, how could you tell that it was Lehman's, and then is it still alive? Sorry.
Okay, just by the pattern of the stubs, I know which natives are in that area, and the natives that are in that area are not bunch grasses that are growing in among the layman's. The layman's is the only bunch grass that is there. And those stubs are definitely from a bunch grass. And also the stems are much more coarse on the layman's than on the natives. Now, if they're alive, the live part is in the crown, which is like the stem tissue, and it's just below the surface of the ground. If we get any rain between now and February, mid-February is when the plants start greening up again, and we'll know the live ones from the dead ones.
It's a long question.
Did you ask a question? You were muted there.
I think I was just mumbling.
Oh, okay.
But so it just said, terrific that you're seeing lots of resprouting in the canyons where you have controlled fountain grass. Have you looked at the canyons where you are not controlling these invasive grasses? And if there is similar regrowth in those locations, especially in the grass clump, especially if the grass clumps burned in those areas. So I guess sort of a control group comparing the regrowth.
I have not hiked down in some of those other canyons. Have you, Patty?
No, I haven't done that yet. No.
But that's a good idea. We need to do it.
Yeah, and I guess this also, someone says, I've always heard that the desert flora is not fire adapted. Do the observations of regrowth call this into question?
Well, I think it depends on the species. I think when we're talking about not fire adapted, we're principally talking about the succulents, the cacti. For sure, they are not fire adapted. I don't think we're talking about all species. Insofar as the succulents are part of the overall landscape, the landscape itself is not fire adapted, but there are species within the landscape that are, and those are the ones we pointed out.
I noticed that the barrel cactus, the hedgehogs, they did not do well at all. It looked like some of the barrels actually exploded from the fire or the heat. A lot of saguaros were spared just because of the patchiness, but there are quite a few saguaros and big saguaros that are not going to make it at all.
That was really disturbing to see the pictures of the fire. I've avoided looking at those. Let's see, and several people just have commented on what an interesting and good talk it is, and also the good work that you all are doing.
Thank you.
And here, this is something more about the deergrass and fountaingrass. So for muley versus fountaingrass, fountaingrass has irregular whiskers around the leaf collar like bufflegrass. Muley species I've seen in drainages have either no hairs or regular straight hairs. So that means you have to get down and really look at it, right? That's getting down there and really observing.
Yeah. There's something else though that we discovered that's quite interesting. And at the beginning, when you go into these just pure stands of fountain grass, you can't help but spray unintentionally a lot of deer grass. And when we went back in to areas that had been sprayed, we found that the fountain grass was far more susceptible to the herbicide, and they died back much more than the deer grass. And the deer grass that had been hit by the herbicide and the leaves were burned back, very often the plants greened up and grew back, and the fountain grasses did not. And so it looked like, in a relative way, the deer grass was more tolerant to glyphosate than the fountain grass. So this was a kind of a serendipity discovery that we made, and we're happy about it.
Oh, that's good.
I think one more thing to add to that is that when you're out spraying, you get a search image for after a while for what deer grass looks like versus fountain grass. And you get just, I don't even know how to describe what the differences are. I mean, I can try, but you get so that you don't make that mistake that, like John mentioned, nearly so often after a while. And then when the fountain grass is mostly wiped out, of course, it's a lot easier.
As far as using the glyphosate, there's a question, is there concern about glyphosate seeping into streams or into native plant communities while you're trying to take out these invasives, which actually, I guess you just mentioned that with the deer grass.
Well, the thing about glyphosate is that if you're spraying it on the soil with a soil background, the molecule immediately binds very tightly with soil particles, and it doesn't move in the soil. So there's no problem about leaching in the soil. As far as the water goes, these streams are intermittent, and by the time any herbicide is in the water goes very far downstream, it's dried up and it's reached dry ground, and it simply binds with the soil. It isn't as if it's flowing into the Mississippi River and a continuous flow of water. Yeah.
And then actually, this is a question that just came to my mind. Early in the talk, you mentioned too that you were using a mixture that has protection for amphibians. So is that something that you have to ask for specifically?
Yeah, regular Roundup has a surfactant in it, which inhibits the metamorphosis from the going from one stage of an amphibian to another. And so we use an aquatic version of glyphosate, which doesn't have that same surfactant. And so it's friendly to amphibians. And when you buy this stuff, you can just ask for an aquatic glyphosate. And there are many trade names now available. Aquamaster is just one of them.
And then what about the seeds? Once the seeds are sprayed, then are they able to sprout, or is that the end for them?
Well, it depends, I mean, we don't spray plants so late that they have viable seed. We spray them before they set seed. Obviously, if it is set seed, even if you spray it, it's still going to be viable seed. And then the seed bank in the ground, we've been doing this for 5 years. And then any seedling of fountaingrass or those other invasives, we just keep spraying. So over time, we are exhausting the seed bank.
Oh yeah, there was a question about the seed bank too, so okay. And then some discussion about Arizona walnut, which people were able to answer. That. So I think we've covered all the questions.
Now, one thing we didn't mention is that until the fire came, we started to see an increasing abundance of red-spotted toads and canyon tree frogs in both of those canyons. Because what happened is that we were opening up the canopy and suddenly the pools had sunlight, and this sunlight then was welcoming the amphibian life.
Well, it sounds like we may be sort of at the end of the questions in the chat. I mean, if there's anyone who's with us and who would like to unmute themselves and ask a question in real time, I think we'd be open to that. Otherwise, we will close down. But is there anyone who'd like to hit their unmute button and ask a question?
No,
I'm not hearing anyone, but there are several other comments thanking the speakers for the talk. So it was a great talk. Thank you very much, Patty and John, for updating us on all this. And we've made a recording of the talk, and so you can check it out yourselves on the YouTube channel, not right away, but in a little bit of time when we get it up. So that's the end of our session today. Thanks to everyone for coming. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have a talk on December 10th, where we talk about holiday desserts and beverages that incorporate native plant ingredients. And we have 3 great speakers. And so I hope that you will all join us for that as a pre-holiday sort of botanical celebration. So thanks again for coming, and I'm going to end the meeting now. Remember that if you're interested in joining the Buffalo Slayers on their efforts, or if you have photos you want to try and craft into educational groups, or if you are interested in maybe joining a group that will maintain Z's Garden at the Mission Gardens, please send us an email, and we'll see you next month, if not before. Thanks a lot for coming.
Everybody, bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Lynn.
Yep. Thanks,
Bye,
John
Patty.
and Patty.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.